Lorcana has finally released, which means hopefully you were lucky enough to get your hands on some cards. Now that you have them, you want to play with them, but you don't know where to start. Maybe you're just checking the game out, maybe you're new and you've never played a TCG, or maybe you just need a little refresher. Either way, you've come to the right place because in this video, I'm going to teach you how you can build your very own deck through multiple different strategies, and you'll even get to watch me build a deck on my own so that you can see the tips that I've given you in action. With that, I want to teach you about one of the easiest ways of deck building, and that's net decking. Net decking is a term used for when you find a deck that someone else has built, usually online, and copy the deck list so that you can build that exact deck and play it yourself. I want to preface this by saying there is absolutely nothing wrong with net decking, and I actually encourage it. It's a great place to start for people who don't want to spend the time building and testing a deck, or for people who just want to grab a deck that they know has already been tested. It's a great way to not only learn how to play different decks and play styles, but also learn how to build them if you study the lists that you're net decking. There's plenty of people already making videos about popular Lorcana decks that have been tested, and you can always go to websites like dreamborn.inc and lorcania.com to find deck lists that people are making and uploading daily. In fact, one of the best ways to deck build is to start with a deck someone has already built and adjust it to fit your playstyle by inserting and removing cards as you want. Another great start to deck building, especially for beginners and people just getting into Lorcana, is to take any one of the starter decks, or all three, and use those as a base to build out your decks. As you collect more cards and open more packs, take cards that will improve your deck and replace them with a card that isn't doing a lot of work. If you really wanted to get fancy, you could buy two starter decks that each have a color you like, take them apart, then mash them together to combine colors you want to play together. Using a starter deck as a base is a great way to get you a solid set of cards to start playing with, a foundation that you can build on over time. Now I know those answers aren't going to be good enough for some of you. Some of you are daring and bold. You have ideas of decks and you want to craft the perfect list. You might even be thinking of deck ideas right now, you just don't know how to properly take those genius ideas and put together a deck that functions. This is for the people who want to know how to build a deck from scratch. I'll very quickly go over the rules around deck building in Lorcana just to get that out of the way. In Lorcana, your deck must contain a minimum of 60 cards, but can be more than that and is restricted to only 2 colors. You can also only have 4 copies of any unique card in your deck. For example, even though Mickey Mouse Wayward Sorcerer and Mickey Mouse Brave Little Tailor are both Mickey Mouse, you can have up to 4 cards of each of them in your deck if you'd like. And that's it when it comes to deck restrictions in Lorcana. Super easy. Building a deck from scratch is one of the most fun and rewarding parts of a TCG in my opinion. You really feel ownership over it, and when it wins games, you're not only proud that you won, but you're proud that you won with a deck you made completely on your own. There are 3 key things I like to think about when building my decks. The first thing you have to figure out is what kind of deck you want to build, and specifically, what's the win condition going to be? There are many things you can build your deck around, from synergies like princesses, or you can have a specific card you want to build your deck around like Dr. Facilier. You can build a deck around keywords like evasive or support, and you can craft a crazy combo to one-turn knockout, or OTK, your opponent with something like Aerial Who's It Collector and items. If you want to take a broader approach, you can also build a deck around a specific playstyle you like. Those of you new to TCGs might not know that yet, so don't worry too much about it, but generally there are 3 playstyles: aggro, mid-range, and control. The idea behind this is you just build a deck that generally does one of those things well. So an aggro deck would be low to the ground and fast, questing quickly and trying to end the game early. Mid-range would focus on, you guessed it, the mid-game by playing on curve every turn and playing characters and items that offer great value and keep you just ahead of your opponent. And control decks look to extend the game out, usually trying to outlast your opponent until they run out of steam, where you can eventually take over the game and win in the late game. And even broader than that, you can just pick a favorite color or 2 and start building there. Regardless of which avenue you want to take to start your deck building, you've got to choose a starting color. In this example, I want to build a deck around Stitch Rockstar, which means my starting color will be amber. I chose Stitch Rockstar because there's already a well-defined and tested aggro package revolving around Stitch that I can show you, and he's simply my favorite Disney character. Once I've decided I want to build around Stitch, it's important that I know what Stitch's strengths are so I can complement those for this deck and build around a win condition which involves utilizing those strengths. Stitch is a Floodborn character, which means he can shift onto other Stitch cards to get out early, so I need to be looking at all other Stitch cards to utilize this ability. The most impactful thing about Stitch though is his ability Adoring Fans, which says whenever you play a character with 2 costs or less, you may exert them to draw a card. This makes for a great ability for an aggro deck because we can play a bunch of cheap units, using them to draw even more cheap units, flooding the board and making it difficult for the opponent to keep up. So that's the direction we want to go with this deck. Now that we've figured out what kind of deck we want to build, we need to pick our secondary color. We want to make sure the second color complements the win condition of this deck. Because Stitch wants to see a bunch of characters that cost 2 or less, it's ideal we pick a color that has a lot of options for 1 and 2 cost characters, preferably ones that are strong. What I like to do is go to dreamborn.inc or lorcania.com, sort by cost from lowest to highest, and we can go through each ink one at a time. To get an idea idea of what we're working with, we'll start with amber because we know we're working in that color, and it'll give us a better idea of what we might need when filling out the rest of the deck. This is where we can even start adding cards to our deck list if we want, which is kind of combining the next step, which is finding the cards that are absolutely necessary for your win condition. As mentioned before, Stitch is a Floodborn character that can shift, so we want to give Stitch a target he can shift onto. Stitch New Dog is perfect for this and directly contributes to our win condition, so we want to add as many of these as we can to our deck, so we'll add 4. Because we're an aggro deck, we want to gain lore as fast as possible and end the game quickly, so a card like Lilo Making a Wish is a very strong card in our deck too, because for 1 ink we can play a card that generates 2 lore, so we'll add 4 of her as well. I also notice Hey Hey, who has the support ability which lets us give his strength to another character when he quests. Although this could be useful since we want to aggressively quest with our units, it doesn't directly improve our win condition, so I'm going to pass on Hey Hey for now, but keep him in the back of my mind when we go back and fill out the deck. I'll quickly go through some of the cards. I don't want to go through them all so this video isn't too long. LeFou is a good pick because he generates 2 lore. Simba is a perfect card because he has bodyguard, so he can protect all of our small characters from being challenged. Simba also combos perfectly with Stitch's ability since we can play Simba, exert him with Stitch to draw a card, and now Simba is exerted in protecting everything else, so he's definitely a 4 of. We definitely want to consider Be Our Guest because it filters through our deck and helps us find key cards like Stitch Rockstar, which plays a big role in our win condition. Lantern also allows us to get Stitch Rockstar out on turn 3 by playing Stitch New Dog on turn 1, Lantern on turn 2, then using Lantern to reduce the shift cost of Stitch Rockstar so you can play him on turn 3. I like this combo, so we'll add Lanterns into the deck and keep an eye on the card count. If I don't think it's worth the 4 cards in testing, I can always adjust. That's all of the 1 and 2 cost cards which could directly improve our win condition through Stitch's ability, so I'll scan the other cards in amber just so I know what we're working with, then look at the other colors to see which one will pair with this strategy best. There's a couple more lore batteries like Mickey and Ariel, a little recursion through Hades which would let us get our Stitches back from the discard pile, and a few more top-end bodyguards with Goofy and Maximus. Keeping that in mind, we'll start looking at the other colors starting with Amethyst. Overall, I see 7 other 1 to 2 cost cards we could use in Amethyst, which is great for Stitch. Cheap cards like Befuddle might be nice to have a cheap action to slow our opponent down just a little while trying to keep up with us. I know Magic Broom Bucket Brigade is directly synergistic with Stitch and also has synergy with Mickey, which reduces their cost and bounces them back to hand when defeated in a challenge, giving us a flexible character we can use to either draw cards with Stitch or balance out the board by challenging the opponent's characters so they aren't taking out our lore batteries. There's also a lot of good draw options to keep our hand full in case we don't draw into Stitch or he gets removed. We know we'll be inking cards and trying to play multiple cards a turn as the game goes on, so it's really important to keep our hand full. Cards like Rafiki and Jafar can help us stabilize in the mid game if we need a little extra time getting to 20 lore, both of which are under 5 ink costs, so not too expensive for our deck. And if we really wanted to, there's Dr. Facilier at the top end, which can shift for 5 and would bounce all of our cheap units back to hand if they were defeated in a challenge. Amethyst is looking like a really strong contender for our secondary ink. Something else I want to mention is I'm paying attention to how many of the cards are uninkable, signified by the lack of flourish around the card's cost. We already have 8 uninkable cards in the deck with Lilo and Lantern, so we have to be careful that we don't put too many uninkable cards in our deck that we aren't drawing enough cards to ink for the first multiple turns of the game. I try not to go over 12 if I want to be safe, but we can always add and take away through testing. This might heavily influence what ink we decide to go with or what cards we decide to include and take out. Next is Emerald, which has 7 1 and 2 cost characters, some of them really strong. Most of them are 2 costs, which means we'll be playing slightly less of them each turn, which is worth noting. Aladdin has Ward, which means he'll be protected by something like Fire the Cannons. Cruella lets us bounce an opposing characters, slowing them down a little and making it harder to challenge all our characters. Flynn makes the opponent discard a card when he's challenged, and he has 2 lore, which makes him a very good card for this deck, especially if we want to go with a more discard-centered style with the Amber discard card we saw earlier. Once we get out of the 1 and 2 drops, we see cards like Cheshire, which is a good lore battery. Peter Pan is a cheap evasive character that can add some pressure. Mother Knows Best is a good bounce card to slow the opponent down, but it is uninkable. Towards the high end of what we want to be playing, we also see Hans, which is a relatively cheap unit for 3 lore, making him a very good lore battery for us. Tinkerbell is another evasive, and cards like Cusco and Mad Hatter can be powerhouses if we're okay with their cost. Most of these cards don't synergize with Stitch specifically, but they do line up with our very aggressive questing strategy. Emerald is definitely another strong consideration. Looking at Ruby, there are only 4 cards that are 2 cost or lower, and one of them you can't quest with, so this isn't looking very useful to us. Most of what's in here isn't very synergistic with Stitch's win condition, so we'll probably pass on Ruby. Sapphire also has only 4 cards that are 2 costs and lower. They aren't bad cards, but ultimately Sapphire looks like it has better lore batteries above 2 costs, which isn't going to help us in this deck. The ramp package doesn't help us much either, so we'll we'll pass on Sapphire too. Finally, with Steel, we have 5 characters that are 2 costs or less. Although these characters can be used to trigger Stitch's ability, Captain Hook and Prince Eric are meant more for challenging, which is the opposite of what we want to do since our goal is to quest aggressively and end the game quickly. When looking at the rest of Steel's cards, we can see a lot of them focus on controlling the board through direct damage and item removal, which doesn't really line up with our game plan either, so I think we'll skip on Steel too. All things considered, I think Amethyst or Emerald would be good choices for our win condition, but I'm going to go with Amethyst for this video because of the amount of synergy with Stitch specifically. Now that we've selected our second ink color, again we'll look for any cards that we know will directly improve our win condition. Although Maleficent is another uninkable card, she is another high lore, low cost unit. There's an argument to be made for not putting 4 of her in the deck because we already have Lilo, or not putting any of her in there at all, but for now I'm going to throw her in there. We can always adjust after. Pascal is another good card because of his evasive ability. Often we will have other characters out on board, and Pascal is a better unit to use with Stitch's ability because it's less likely to be challenged the next turn because of his evasive keyword. As mentioned before, the magic brooms have lots of synergy both with Stitch and Mickey, not only improving our win condition with Stitch, but giving us flexibility to have a character to challenge with if needed. And brooms will let us shuffle cards back into our deck that we need if they end up in our discard. For now, those are mainly the cards that directly improve our win condition, which means we can move on to the next major step in deck building, which is your ink curve. Your ink curve is just a small chart that shows you how many cards of each ink cost you run in your deck. It's a great way to see if there are any holes in your deck currently or any places that can be filled out. Your ink curve will look a little different depending on the kind of deck you're building. For example, this aggro deck is really low to the ground, so I expect the top of the curve to be closer to the 1 and 2 cost cards. If we were running a mid-range deck, I would expect the top of the curve to be somewhere around the 4 to 6 cost cards, and for control decks, it would be towards the 6 plus cost cards. These are generalizations, and sometimes they may not be perfect curves, but it's a great place to start when analyzing your deck. Another reason to look at the ink curve is because you want to make sure you have cards to play at most stages of the game. So if you don't have any 4-drops in your deck, it might be worth looking at the 4-drops available to you so that you're playing the most cost-efficient and valuable cards you can as the game goes on. In this case, it's obvious that we have our 1 and 2 cost cards filled out, then there's a big gap between them and Stitch at 6. So it might be smart for us to fill out our 3 to 5 cost cards. When doing this, I like to think about what our deck might struggle with to see if there are cards that might not directly improve our win condition through Stitch, but will strengthen areas where we can and solidify the deck. A lot of time, this is generally something like card draw, board control, or lore batteries. We already have plenty of lore batteries, but with how low to the ground this deck is, and with how many cards we should be playing on average because of how cheap the cards are, we need lots of card draw. On top of that, the purpose for most of our characters in the deck so far is to quest. We also need a few characters / cards to easily get rid of opposing threats to our board, whether that be through hard removal or challenges. Even though this is an aggro deck, it's still good to add a couple cards to help us navigate through the mid game so we don't get wiped out and overrun. With that being said, let's look at the 3 to 5 cost cards in both Amber and Amethyst now. Knowing we have the brooms in deck, I'm immediately going to add Mickey because he gives us the flexibility with those brooms to use them as challengers when needed. Maleficent doesn't trigger Stitch's ability, but does the same thing by drawing us a card when she's played, so we'll add her so we can keep our hand full. She can also sing Friends on the Other Side, which is one of the best draw cards in the game, so we'll add that as well. We also need something that can answer threats immediately. Because there's not hard removal in Amber or Amethyst, we have to rely on challenges, which makes rush characters perfect for this. Rafiki is a great solution for us because he's relatively cheap and hits for 3 strength, so we'll add him to the deck so we can make trades without having to use our lore batteries. Finally, for some of those bigger willpower characters, Jafar is perfect because he can just sit on the board, threatening any of the opposing characters who want to quest or challenge. With the addition of Jafar, that puts our deck at 60 cards. Like I said before, this is just the minimum number of cards required for a legal Lorcana deck, but that brings up a topic I want to talk about, which is consistency. Just because we can add more than 60 cards doesn't always mean that we should. The more cards we add to our deck, the less likely we're making it for us to see other cards we need in order for our deck to function. When possible, I highly suggest finding a way to run 60 cards because that is the most consistent your deck will ever be. The same thing applies when it comes to deciding how many of a single card you decide to include. You'll notice I've added a playset of every card in this deck that I chose, a playset being 4 cards. I like to call decks like this a solid 15 because you have 4 copies of exactly 15 cards in your deck to make a 60 card deck, which is the most consistent a deck will ever be. This is generally where I like to start when building out a deck for the first time. There are definitely reasons to only include 1, 2, or 3 copies of a card in a deck instead of 4, but you have to be careful. If you spread your deck too thin by including too many 1 and 2 copies of cards, it won't be very consistent and you won't see the cards you need to see reliably. If you don't put any 1 or 2 copies of specific cards in your deck, also known as teching a card, you may run into trouble against certain decks because you don't have an answer to it. Because of the way Lorcana's resource system works, where you can put cards you don't need into your inkwell, you can pretty easily get away with running a few tech cards here and there. If you draw them and don't need them for the specific matchup, so long as they're inkable, you can just put them in your inkwell. I like to start with a solid 15 though, because as I play more games, I'll start to figure out what cards I might need to tech into the deck. For example, this deck currently has no way of dealing with evasive units. Jetsam is a great card for this, but I'm already at 60 cards. I could decide that just for the deck that runs evasives, I'll take out 2 BR Guests and a Jafar so that I can run 3 Jetsams. Or maybe I find my deck is too slow at challenging and I want to add a Pocket Watch or 2. I can take those cards in for other things. This leads me to my third and final primary tip for deck building, which is to test, test, and test. A deck list is rarely ever 100% complete. As time goes on, cards come into the meta and leave. Certain decks get popular that you have to put cards into to counter, then they disappear so you take those cards out. You should be constantly analyzing your deck for cards that could optimize it if you want it to be perfect. The meta is always shifting, and because of that, so will your deck. When playing games, just pay attention to the times you find yourself saying, man, this card would be really nice to have, or you find yourself running into a problem consistently. You can always go back and see if there are any cards you can put into your deck to solve these problems. The same thing applies to cards you find yourself never using or drawing too many of. You can always take cards out of your deck. You'll never know how good your deck is if you don't play it, and the more you play it, the more you'll see where its weaknesses are and can improve on that. Increase the number of cards you find yourself needing and decrease the cards you aren't using. And with that, we finally got our Stitch Rockstar aggro deck. The beauty of deck building is you could still take this deck and make any modifications to it you see fit. Do you want to include Goofy so you have a late game bodyguard that protects your little units so they can quest to victory? Go for it. Do you want to add Hades so you can keep bringing back your cheap guys that quest for a lot of lore, applying tons of pressure to your opponent? Do it. Have fun and test out different variations of a deck you want to build until you find something you really like and resonate with. Use deck building as a way of expressing yourself. Hopefully you were able to find some value in this video and I helped you understand a little better how you can build a Lorcana deck, or made you a little more confident at trying it yourself. If you enjoyed the video, I'd super appreciate if you gave it a like so I know I did a good job. I really want to hear your opinions in the comments. I know a bunch of you had deck ideas you were thinking about during the video and might have even started building before this video ended. I want to know what my viewers are brewing. Let me know what spicy decks you're trying to make in the comments, or let me know how you would have built this deck differently. If you have other deck ideas you want to watch me build, drop them in the comments below. If you enjoy this kind of content, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. I've got a lot coming, and if you want to keep up with me and what I'm doing, or when a video gets posted, you can also follow me on Twitter. Most importantly, remember to take care of yourself. My name is Brandon, also known as B Squared. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.